Hi, my name is Lily, and today I'm going to be discussing some historically contextual films, specifically those that are covering events quite close to when the film was released, and the effect that these films had on the public. The first film I'm going to be talking about is Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation came out in 1915. It covers the Civil War and glorifies and romanticizes the South and the KKK, or otherwise known as the Ku Klux Klan. The reason this film is so widely talked about in the filmmaking business to this day is because of the innovation and creativity that the director took on, as well as it being considered one of the first feature-length films due to its long timestamp, almost 3 hours. But it's also quite talked about because of the controversial racism shown throughout the film. Not only is the KKK romanticized, but black people are demonized. It's really quite horrific to watch. It is, in fact, responsible for the instigation of the KKK in the public, where it was already dying down. And although racism was still alive and is still alive today, at the time, the KKK really wasn't quite active. But after this film's release, it became a full-fledged organization once again. Hate crimes rose, and the level of the effect this film had was such an extreme degree that it resulted in people losing their lives. Out of the films I'll be discussing today, this film is the one with the greatest impact on the public after its release. The accuracy of the film, I have to say, is not so great considering the romanticization glorification of the South and of the KKK. The second film I'm going to be discussing is Spotlight from 2015. Spotlight covers journalists and their uncovering of the predatory behavior throughout the Catholic Church. It takes place in the early 2000s, so it's a little over a decade after the story takes place when the film was released. And for those reasons, some of it is quite inaccurate because they took things that happened after the time period they are covering and including that into that time. The journalists we follow in this film are actually real people, just as the victims are real people. The story is quite accurate in the sense of the people. It's more so the events and the timeline that is inaccurate. However, you have to give this film a pat on the back due to its handling of a very difficult topic.
90 priests.
Is that possible?
From a metric standpoint, yes. That would certainly be in line with my findings.
The effect this film had on the public was not as disruptive as expected. The Catholic Church actually was not telling people to not go watch the film. Rather, I believe they were encouraging them, as it tells the story from a fact-checking point, and really gives you some moving and difficult scenes, yet is such an incredible film altogether that I would personally recommend it.
Can you tell me specifically what happened?
Specifically, he molested me.
Joe, I think that the language is going to be so important here. We can't sanitize this. Just saying molest isn't enough. People need to know what actually happened.
We should probably get these to go.
As I said, the accuracy is all over the place, which is the reason that this film, out of the films I'll be discussing today, is the closest to what we typically see in a historical film. There's some dramatization of certain things, under-dramatization of other things, some things taken out, some things meshed together that were actually quite separate in the real timeline. And that's completely normal in the filmmaking business. And for those reasons, this film is something that you have to take with a grain of salt and do your research afterwards, which I would recommend for really any historically contextual film you ever watch. And now for the third film I'm going to be discussing today, All the President's Men from 1976. I'm really excited about this film, as you can see. It's really quite fantastic and considered one of the most accurate historical films when it comes to political events. In the film, we follow two journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, who actually wrote a novel about these events, which is what the film is based off of. And the timeline is 1972 to 1974, so really quite close in relationship to when the film was released. It's really quite fantastic in the way that it portrays this story. It starts off with news footage of Nixon, and then in between certain scenes throughout the film, we see more news footage. So it really brings people, the audience of the time this film was released, back to that moment just several years prior that most of them can probably remember.
Ladies and gentlemen, President Nixon will, in a moment, address the Congress and the people of the United States.
Arguably one of the best scenes in the film is the last scene where we see a tiny little television playing Nixon's second inauguration, and next to that we see Woodward and Bernstein, and the two of them are typing away their story that is about to take down Nixon.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. That I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States. And will, to the best of my ability. And will, to the best of my ability. Preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Preserve and protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. So help me God. So help me God.
It's really quite a fantastic scene, and ironic, and although quite simple, it's very powerful. And at the time this film came out, sure, there was still division in the United States public when it comes to politics. There were a lot of Republicans who stood by Nixon, said that he was innocent, or said that, his behavior wasn't wrong. Whereas there were also Republicans who admitted they were ashamed, astonished, stunned by Nixon's actions and by his looking into finding dirt, basically, on his Democratic opponents. This illegal activity and the discovery of it is quite an exciting tale, and so this film is definitely something I would recommend. Because of its accuracy, it actually does go over 2 hours. It's about 2 hours and 20 minutes, but it doesn't go slowly because they're really trying to take you along the story, and the story is quite exciting and quite thrilling, so there's always something new coming to the mix. The only thing they glossed over throughout the film was Caroline Graham's involvement, and Caroline Graham was the owner of the Washington Post, who the two journalists Woodward and Bernstein worked for, and she did actually have just as much a say in what was being put out into the newspaper as the editor-in-chief did. And the editor is given a lot more screen time, whereas Catherine Graham's name, I believe, is mentioned once. So those are all the films I'm going to be discussing today. I hope that maybe you learned something, or maybe you're intrigued by one of these films and want to go watch it. It's all a learning experience, and really I would recommend watching historical films because they can provide a foundation of information on events, and from there you can go on and do your own research and learn so much more. I truly think that filmmakers need to put in more time into, if they're going to tell a real story, tell it accurately to the best of your ability, because if you have to dramatize the story, then perhaps it's really not worth telling.